Moving to Charleston was a step into the unknown for me, but at the same time, it was a long-awaited chance to start a new life. The city welcomed me with a clear sky, the gentle whisper of the Atlantic Ocean, and the cozy magic of its streets. Cobblestone roads, centuries-old oaks with sprawling, moss-draped branches, and historic homes steeped in the past seemed to whisper, "Here, I might finally find what I had been searching for so long." Our house looked like something straight out of a postcard. Its white facade, spacious windows, and a veranda entwined with blooming roses created a picture-perfect image. Inside, everything exuded warmth. Light-colored walls, wooden floors, and soft light streaming through lace curtains. The house felt alive, as though it had been waiting for the return of voices and laughter. I came here with Trevor, my husband, and his son, Caleb. Trevor was a caring man, but work had always been his top priority. He seemed to believe that love was something implicit, something that didn't need constant explanation or outward demonstration. This simplicity was endearing, yet at times it left me with a faint sense of loneliness. Caleb, on the other hand, was a mystery I couldn't unravel. At 16, he seemed older than his years, quiet, reserved, and surrounded by an invisible wall. He greeted me on our first meeting with coldness, almost indifference, which immediately made me feel like an outsider. However, I didn't blame him. Change is never easy, and I suspected my role in his life felt to him like more than just an unexpected twist. That first night, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of our new home. From the street came the occasional footsteps of passers-by and the rustling of leaves underfoot. In the distance, the melody of a piano drifted from a neighboring house as if someone had turned to the keys to release the day's worries. I watched Trevor sleeping beside me, his breathing steady and calm. Over the past few months, he had become my island of stability in an ocean of change. But as I reflected on that stability, I couldn't help but wonder, could I become the same for his son? Or would I remain a stranger, an unwelcome figure in a life already too tangled with confusion? Before going to bed, I walked over to the window. The moonlight bathed the garden, where rose bushes swayed in the breeze. This city held countless stories, and now, I was unwittingly becoming part of one of them. Caleb was sitting on the porch, engrossed in his phone, when I decided to start a conversation for the first time. I approached him slowly, taking care not to startle him. The wooden boards of the veranda creaked under my feet, and he reluctantly glanced up, clearly displeased by my presence. "How do you like it here?" I began, trying to keep my tone casual, as if the conversation were something natural, something that was bound to happen. "It's fine," he replied curtly, his attention already back on the screen. His one-word response stung. It wasn't rudeness, more a kind of detachment, a deliberate effort to shield himself from anything that might breach his inner world. I lingered for a moment, hoping he might continue, but Caleb stayed silent, as if the conversation had already ended. I smiled, pretending it didn't bother me, and headed back inside, leaving him alone. It hurt, but I reminded myself that trust takes time. He's a teenager, I told myself, and he's in a tough spot. This isn't about me, it's about him. Patience. That evening, I decided to take a small step forward. I asked Trevor about Caleb's favorite food and learned that he loved lasagna. I figured that something simple and familiar, like food, might help me break through his walls, even just a little. When the dish was ready, I called him to dinner. "Caleb, I heard you like lasagna," I said, setting the steaming tray on the table. "I hope it's as good as your grandmother's." He looked at me as though trying to decipher my motives. But then, without a word, he sat down. There was a caution in his every movement. He took a plate and served himself with the kind of care that suggested he was wary of a trap. "How is it?" I asked, watching his reaction closely. "It's not bad," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. That small moment turned out to mean more than I could have imagined. It was just a smile, but it felt genuine. For the first time, I felt like perhaps he wasn't as impenetrable as he seemed. Later that evening, as I was clearing the dishes, I heard him quietly say, thanks for dinner. It was so unexpected that I almost dropped a plate. But I quickly composed myself, smiled, and replied, "You're welcome. If you want, you can help next time." He didn't respond, but he didn't look opposed to the idea either. It was a tiny victory, but it felt significant. Moments like these, I realized, were the way to reach him. When Trevor left on a business trip for a few days, the house felt empty. I was left alone with Caleb, and it brought its own challenges. Trevor had always been an unintentional bridge between us. Without him, we were forced to interact directly, without a mediator. The first day passed in silence. Caleb kept his distance, spending most of his time in his room or in the garden with a book. His presence was like a quiet backdrop. Subtle, barely noticeable, yet undeniably significant. On the second day, I decided to make a move. After dinner, I suggested, "Want to watch a movie?" I found something interesting. To my surprise, he agreed, though with a restrained air, as if he didn't want it to seem like he was giving in. We settled on the living room couch, and I put on a classic, To Kill a Mockingbird. I thought this film might catch his interest. A compelling story, deep characters, and moral dilemmas. At first, he sat slightly stiff, arms crossed over his chest. But as the film progressed, I noticed him becoming more engaged. His gaze grew focused, and during one key scene, he murmured softly, "Atticus, he's a real hero." I smiled, realizing it was the first time I'd heard his voice without its usual detachment, but with genuine interest. When the movie ended, Caleb unexpectedly said, "Thanks. That was cool." At that moment, it felt like a fragile bond had begun to form between us. The next day, he approached me in the kitchen, holding a book. "Have you read this?" he asked, showing me the cover of Fahrenheit 451. "Of course," I replied, thrilled by his initiative. "It's one of my favorites." "I think Fahrenheit's a little naive," he said, squinting slightly as if testing my reaction. "But there's something to it." We ended up talking about the book for over an hour, diving into its themes, characters, and symbolism. Caleb was sharp, attentive to details, and his arguments felt like more than just opinions. They were his way of trying to understand my perspective as well. By the third evening, I noticed he no longer avoided my gaze and even initiated conversations from time to time. It was surprising, but welcome. We discussed movies, books, and random thoughts that came to mind. Although a certain distance still lingered, the ice was starting to melt. During dinner on the last evening before Trevor's return, Caleb suddenly said, "You know, you're not what I expected." I looked up, surprised by his honesty. "Is that good or bad?" I asked with a smile. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Probably good." That short reply, free from his usual edge, felt like an acknowledgement. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see me not just as his father's wife, but as someone willing to listen and understand him. The evening was quiet and warm. All day, a light rain had fallen, leaving tiny droplets clinging to the leaves, shimmering under the glow of the streetlights. Caleb was sitting on the porch with a book in his hands, and I decided to join him, carrying a cup of tea. Over the past few days, this had become something of an unspoken tradition for us, finding time for quiet conversations. "What are you reading?" I asked as I settled into the chair next to him. He held up the cover without saying a word. Ray Bradbury, again. I smiled, recognizing the book, and we lapsed into silence. It wasn't an awkward silence, rather, it was filled with a quiet sense of presence. Sometimes you don't need to speak to feel connected. Have you ever felt like everything in life is going wrong? He asked suddenly, closing his book. His question caught me off guard. There was more in his voice than mere teenage curiosity. I set my cup down and looked at him. "Of course," I replied. "There are times when it feels like everything's falling apart, but then you find something that helps you get through it. For some, it's friends, books, or music." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Sometimes I feel like I'm my own worst enemy. I know it sounds stupid. It's not stupid, Caleb. It's honest. He turned to look at me, and in that moment, something shifted. His usually guarded eyes opened up, filled with doubt, questions, and a strange warmth. I could sense him trying to figure out if I truly saw him as more than just his father's son, a person with his own struggles and emotions. Do you really understand me? Or are you just saying this to make me feel better? He asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. I'm trying to understand, I answered honestly. It's not always easy, but I'm trying. Caleb smiled as he had once during dinner. But this time, the smile was different, more personal, as if he was grateful for my words. We sat there for another hour, talking about everything. Books, future plans, dreams. I shared stories about my life before meeting Trevor, and Caleb opened up about how hard it sometimes is to figure out what you truly want. As we were getting ready to head to bed, he suddenly said, "You've changed the way I see a lot of things. I hope for the better," I replied with a soft smile. "Yeah," he said simply, then added, almost in a whisper, "I'm glad you came into our lives." His words stirred something deep inside me. I realized that this evening had left a mark not just on him, but on me as well. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was simply gratitude from a teenager finally learning to trust someone. But as I lay in bed, his words echoed in my mind. The next day seemed ordinary. In the morning, I went grocery shopping while Caleb stayed at home. When I returned, I found him in the garden, frowning slightly as he worked near a rose bush. "Everything okay?" I asked, approaching him. "These roses seem mad at me," he muttered, removing a dried bud. "Yesterday they looked fine, and today they act like they've given up on life." I smiled, amused by his unexpected concern for the garden. "They're just finicky. They need a little attention and patience, like all of us," I said with a small laugh. "I don't know. You're more patient than I am," he replied, looking up at me. I noticed something different in his gaze. It was focused yet vulnerable, as if he was trying to say more than words could convey. Later, during dinner, Caleb was unusually quiet. His plate remained almost untouched, and when I asked if he was feeling unwell, he just shook his head. I decided not to push him, letting him work through whatever was on his mind. That evening, we found ourselves on the porch again. Caleb fidgeted with the pages of his book, though it was clear he wasn't reading. I could sense he wanted to say something, but was struggling to find the courage. "Is there something you want to talk about?" I asked gently. He looked at me, then quickly turned away, as though waging an internal battle. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I don't know how to explain it, but with you, I feel real. Like someone sees me. Is that weird?" "It's not weird, Caleb. Everyone wants to be seen," I replied softly, careful not to shatter the moment. And then it happened. He stood up abruptly, moved closer, and before I could fully register what was happening, he leaned down and kissed me on the cheek. The gesture was awkward and fleeting, but it carried a sincerity that left me stunned. I stepped back, speechless. "Caleb," I began, searching for the right words. "I'm sorry, His voice was panicked, and his face flushed crimson as he turned away, fists clenched at his sides. "I just wanted, I don't know." "This is wrong," I said at last, my tone firm but gentle. "You need to understand that this can't happen again." Without turning to face me, Caleb nodded quickly. "I'm sorry. I won't do it again," he mumbled before retreating, leaving me alone on the porch. I stood there, frozen, a mix of shock, confusion, and a strange warmth washing over me. I knew I had to address this incident decisively, to draw a clear boundary. But instead, an unsettling unease grew inside me, one I couldn't quite explain. Several days passed after that evening on the porch, but the memory of that moment continued to trouble me. I avoided bringing it up, hoping Caleb would also prefer to leave it behind. However, his behavior had changed. He became more attentive, almost caring, which unsettled me. "Can I help you?" he asked one morning as I struggled with the vacuum cleaner in the living room. "You want to help with cleaning?" I asked, surprised, turning to him. "Why not?" he replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I shrugged and handed him a dusting cloth. His desire to be around me was becoming increasingly evident. He found excuses to come into the kitchen while I was cooking or suggested going for walks to get some fresh air. On one hand, I understood that Caleb was simply searching for a connection he lacked. He had grown up withdrawn, and perhaps I was the first person to give him a bit of attention. But I couldn't ignore the fact that his feelings were straying beyond what was appropriate between a stepson and stepmother. One afternoon, I returned home with groceries and found a book lying on the kitchen table. The cover was adorned with swirling gold lettering, and inside the front page was a note. "You've shown me that happiness is possible. Thank you for that." I stopped in my tracks, holding the note, feeling my heart race. Caleb walked into the room and noticed my unease. Is this from you?" I asked, looking up at him. He nodded, avoiding my gaze. "It's just a book. Nothing special," he muttered. "Caleb, do you understand that this could be misinterpreted?" I began cautiously. "It doesn't matter," he replied firmly, suddenly looking directly at me. "Everything I wanted to say is already said." I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. His words sounded sincere, but they only deepened my inner turmoil. I tried to dismiss the growing unease, convincing myself that this was just teenage emotion, something he would soon outgrow. From that day on, Caleb found more and more reasons to be around me. He asked for my opinions on books, offered to help with chores, and one day even baked a cake, something he had never done before. "I just wanted to try," he explained when I asked what had prompted the idea. Although I tried to maintain a distance, each of his efforts pulled me further into his world. With every passing day, it became clearer. Caleb saw me as more than just his stepmother. I began to notice how our conversations and time together were taking on a new meaning. Caleb no longer looked for excuses to avoid talking or hide behind his phone. Instead, he found ways to linger nearby. At first, it was discussions about books, then conversations about movies, and eventually quiet walks through our peaceful neighborhood. One evening, he suggested we go to the park. I hesitated, but decided a walk couldn't hurt. The park was deserted. Only the rustling of leaves and the occasional sounds of nocturnal birds accompanied our steps. We walked in silence until Caleb finally spoke. "You know, it's nice here, just walking and talking, without all the extra people." I smiled. "Sometimes silence is good. It gives you time to figure things out." "And do you figure things out?" he asked, looking at me intently. His question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to answer. Every word risked steering the conversation into territory I was trying to avoid. "Everyone does, Caleb. The important thing is to be honest with yourself," I replied, hoping he'd catch the hint. "I'm honest. Are you?" He stopped walking and looked directly into my eyes. That gaze was so deep and serious that I felt a wave of unease rising inside me. I couldn't understand where he got such intensity, this ability to look at me as if he already knew the answer to his question. "I try," I finally said, turning away. The next day, we worked in the garden. Caleb suddenly suggested we replant the rose bushes that hadn't been blooming well. We spent hours digging and tending to the soil, talking about everything that didn't directly involve us. "Do you really love flowers?" he asked as I adjusted one of the bushes. "I think I love taking care of things that live and grow," I replied without much thought. "And who takes care of you?" His voice was unexpectedly soft. That question made me pause again. I looked away and answered evasively. "Sometimes people can take care of themselves. It's important to know how to do that." Caleb didn't respond, but I noticed his frown. His silence was more telling than any words. He wasn't just listening. He was thinking, feeling, With each passing day, our encounters grew more profound. We increasingly found reasons to spend time alone, but I knew it wasn't right. These moments felt simple, almost innocent, but deep down I recognized that they meant far more to him than they should. Our walks and conversations continued, but I increasingly felt that the situation was crossing into forbidden territory. Caleb was becoming too close. His words, his looks, none of it felt like friendly interaction anymore. One evening, he said something that brought everything to a halt. We were sitting in the garden where the gentle wind swayed the branches of the trees. Caleb was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. "I can't pretend anymore that things are the same as before," he said, looking at me. "You mean more to me than just my father's wife." His words hung in the air like thunder on a clear day. I felt a knot tighten in my chest and tried to maintain my composure. "Caleb, you can't say things like that," I replied firmly, trying to make my voice sound strict, but he didn't back down. "I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it," he said, dropping his gaze. "You're the only person who truly understands me." "I can't be who you think I am," I tried to explain, the words growing harder to say. "I'm your family, and this is not right." He stood abruptly, his fists clenching nervously. "You don't get to decide how I feel," he snapped. "Do you think I don't know how complicated this is? But I just can't deal with it." I stood up, trying to calm him down. "Caleb, I understand this is difficult for you, but you need to learn how to handle this the right way. You're young, you're confused, and I'm here to help you, but not in the way you want." His face twisted with a mix of anger and hurt. "You're just scared to admit that I mean something to you," he blurted out. "But that doesn't make me a fool." Those words hit me like a blow, but I knew I had to stay firm. "This isn't about fear, Caleb. It's about boundaries that cannot be crossed. We need to stop this. Here and now." After those words, he turned and stormed into the house, slamming the door behind him. I remained standing, feeling an overwhelming mixture of guilt and helplessness. I knew he was in pain, but I also knew there was no other way. That night was long. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house. Somewhere far off, the ticking of a clock reminded me of time, which felt like it had come to a standstill. I couldn't sleep, tormented by the question, could I keep this situation under control, or had it already slipped beyond my grasp? After our conflict, Caleb became withdrawn. He avoided meeting my gaze, spoke only when necessary, and spent as much time away from the house as possible. On the surface, this seemed like the right step to break the connection that had started to form between us. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that his distance hid something deeper. One evening, while Trevor was away again, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I saw Caleb. He stood there holding a sheet of paper, clenched so tightly that the edges were crumpled. "We need to talk," he said, looking somewhere past me. "Caleb, I don't think this is a good idea," I began, but he interrupted me. "Please, just listen." I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. He walked nervously to the window, stared outside as if gathering his thoughts, and then turned to face me. I've tried. I've tried to do everything right. But it's impossible," he said, his voice trembling. "Every time I think I can let go, you do something, or say something, and it pulls me right back. Caleb, I understand how you feel, but you have to understand that this is wrong. It will only confuse both of us more." I tried to keep my voice steady, but my heart was racing. "I can't just turn it off," he said, gripping the paper in his hand even tighter. "I know I'm hurting you. I'm hurting myself, but I don't know how to live with this." His words tore at me. I wanted to be his support, someone who could help him navigate through this, but instead, we were trapped in a situation where every step only heightened the tension. "We have to stop, Caleb." I looked at him, trying to convey how serious this was. "This will destroy you. It will destroy me. And it will destroy Trevor. You do understand the consequences, don't you?" He didn't answer immediately, just took a deep breath and locked eyes with me. What if I don't want to stop? What if I don't care about the consequences? Then I'll have to stop it for both of us, I said firmly, though I was trembling inside. We can't go on like this. It's not right. Caleb pressed his lips together, dropped the crumpled piece of paper onto the table, and turned toward the door. You don't understand. You'll never understand, he said before walking out. When the door closed behind him, I sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. On the table lay the crumpled paper he had left behind. I unfolded it. It was a note, brief but brimming with emotion. You showed me what it's like to feel alive, but maybe that was a mistake. I stared at those words for a long time, realizing just how far this had gone. Caleb was hurt, and I was part of that pain. But what troubled me even more was the unsettling realization that my own emotional barriers were beginning to crack. Trevor returned home earlier than we expected. His business trip was supposed to last a few more days, but in the evening I heard the creak of the front door, followed by his voice calling out, "I'm home. Is anyone here?" My stomach tightened. Caleb and I were in the kitchen, talking. Nothing out of the ordinary, just discussing his recent schoolwork and summer plans. Yet something about his tone, about the way he looked at me, had felt off. Now, hearing Trevor's voice, a wave of anxiety washed over me. Trevor entered the kitchen, his smile fading as he took in the scene. He didn't say anything at first, but seemed immediately on edge. Caleb was sitting too close, his gaze too intense, while I likely appeared unnaturally composed. "Good to see you," I said, forcing a smile. "You're back earlier than we thought." "Finished up sooner than expected," Trevor replied, glancing between us before his brow furrowed. "Is everything okay?" Caleb didn't answer, but his silence was deafening. His jaw clenched as though he was holding something back, but then suddenly he stood up abruptly from the table. "No, it's not okay," he said loudly, his voice startling in its intensity. "I'm done pretending everything is fine." I froze, realizing he was about to say something that would destroy everything. Trevor's confusion deepened, his expression growing more serious. "Caleb, what do you mean?" he asked, staring at his son. Caleb looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and desperation. I could see the inner turmoil raging within him and knew what was about to happen. "I can't keep pretending," he repeated, turning back to his father. He hesitated, then exhaled deeply. "She's the only person who really understands me. More than you ever have." The words hung in the air like a bomb about to detonate. I tried to intervene. "Caleb, stop. You don't need to." But it was too late. Trevor turned to me, and the look in his eyes, a mixture of disbelief and fury, stole the breath from my lungs. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Is there something you're not telling me?" "It's not what you think," I said, trying to stay calm, but my words sounded weak, unconvincing. Caleb spoke again, cutting through the tension. "She tried to keep her distance. It's me. I can't control how I feel. I can't stand it anymore." "Feelings?" Trevor repeated, his voice dropping to an icy tone. "What are you talking about, Caleb?" "I love her," Caleb shouted, his voice echoing through the kitchen. Trevor froze as if the words hadn't yet registered. Then his gaze shifted to me, filled with both pain and anger. "Is this true? Did you know about this?" he asked, his voice trembling. I tried to stop it, I began, but he cut me off. "You tried?" he spat. "This should never have happened in the first place. You've destroyed everything." I stood there, speechless, unable to defend myself. Caleb tried to interject, but Trevor spun around to face him. "You have no idea what you've done," Trevor shouted. "You've put all of us in an impossible situation." "I just told the truth," Caleb yelled back, his voice cracking with emotion. Trevor fell silent as if struggling to find the right words. Then, finally, he turned to me, his face set like stone. "Leave," he said coldly. "I don't want you here anymore." I knew there was nothing I could say to fix this. The damage was done. All bridges burned. I nodded quietly, feeling the weight of the world collapse around me. Caleb tried to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. "No, Caleb. This is the end." With those words, I left the house, leaving everything behind. Them, the memories and the life that had so quickly shattered into pieces. I left Charleston early in the morning while the city still slept. My suitcase was light, but my heart was weighed down with guilt and loss. The lights in the windows of what was no longer my home were still on. I caught a fleeting glimpse of them in the rearview mirror before turning onto the main road. Weeks had passed since I left, but the pain hadn't faded. I rented a small apartment in another city, far from anything that could remind me of what had happened. Every day I tried to fill the void. Work, walks, books. But even the brightest moments felt muted, as if I were viewing them through a thick haze. Sometimes I caught myself imagining Caleb sitting on the porch with a book, or Trevor opening the front door of the house, his heavy but honest smile always making me feel safe. But those images brought no comfort. They only reminded me of what I had lost. Caleb tried to reach out. A letter written in shaky handwriting arrived a couple of weeks later. In it, he said he missed me, that he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt me. But I didn't respond. It was too hard. Replying would mean reviving what we both needed to leave behind. Trevor didn't write at all. I knew he could never forgive me, and I didn't blame him for that. He had lost trust, something I should have protected at all costs. Deep down, I understood that even if he wanted to hear my explanations, they wouldn't change the reality of what had happened. Now I lived in a city where no one knew me. Sometimes it felt freeing. Other times it felt like punishment. I spent long evenings by the window, watching the life of the streets below, watching people hurrying home. They seemed like strangers to me, but I envied their simplicity, their ability to return to a place where they were awaited. One day, I pulled out the book Caleb had given me. I stared at the inscription for a long time. "You showed me what happiness could be." The words burned as though they'd been written in fire. I closed the book, determined not to return to it again. Perhaps time would heal the wounds, but for now, I felt broken. Every day reminded me that mistakes, even those made with good intentions, can destroy everything. Amid these thoughts, I found one anchor. I had learned an important lesson from this story. Life is not just about the choices we make, but also about the consequences we cannot always foresee.